So, there I was, 6:03 in the morning, in nothing but my robe, slippers, and a cup of lukewarm coffee, staring across the frozen battlefield that used to be my peaceful front yard. And that's when I saw her, Karen, marching down the sidewalk like she was leading Napoleon's army across the Alps. Except, instead of a sword, she had my snow shovel. My big, blue, ergonomic, scoop-handle shovel, the Cadillac of winter tools. Gone just like that. She didn't even bother to look guilty. She saw me standing there. She smirked, gave a little wave like she was borrowing sugar, then disappeared into her yard like a frost-covered villain. I didn't move. I didn't shout. I just stood there, steam rising off my coffee and out of my ears, watching the most absurd theft in the history of suburban warfare unfold in real time. And that, my friend, was the moment I knew that this wasn't about a shovel. This was about territory, about pride, about the soul of the neighborhood. And I was about to go full Cold War on her. Now, to understand why this moment was so personal, you've got to know a bit about me. My name's Frank Doyle. I'm 68 years old, a retired firefighter, and a widower with a strict morning routine and a deep, possibly unhealthy relationship with my snow shovel. I live in the kind of neighborhood where people wave at each other but secretly judge your lawn length, and where the homeowners association wields more power than the local government. I've survived flash floods, 3-story blazes, and a cardiac incident during my retirement party, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for Karen. Karen moved in 4 months ago. At first, she seemed harmless, a little tightly wound maybe, the kind of woman who alphabetizes her spice rack and thinks duct tape is unsightly. But then she joined the HOA, and within 2 weeks, she'd somehow become president. The speed of her rise was suspicious. The bylaws were murky. I suspected foul play, possibly involving gluten-free brownies at the last meeting, but I let it slide. I was retired. I was at peace. Until the Great Shovel incident. After I came inside from witnessing the theft, I rewatched the footage from my security camera just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. There she was, 5:58 a.m., creeping across the lawn like a burglar in orthopedic sneakers, flashlight on her head, checking both ways like she was crossing into enemy territory. She walked up to my porch, grabbed the shovel like it was the Holy Grail, and strutted back toward her house with all the confidence of someone who's gotten away with this before. That's when the real rage hit. She didn't even try to hide it. She wanted to be seen. It was a power move fueled by caffeine and betrayal. I stormed out in my robe, marched right over to her pristine front steps, and knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. Just the hum of a Roomba inside and the faint scent of lavender air freshener. She was hiding. Or worse, pretending she wasn't home while holding a stolen item in plain sight. I left a note. Not angry, not threatening, just clear and precise. Return the shovel. You know it's mine. Let's not turn this into something it doesn't need to be. I even drew a smiley face. Old firefighter trick. Disarm the situation. An hour later, the note was back on my door, crumpled, with a sticky note on top that read, per HOA Winter Tool Share Guidelines, items left in view are considered community property. Community property? I read it 3 times. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or scream. I checked the HOA handbook, all 87 pages of it. Not a single mention of winter tool share anything. She made it up. She invented a rule and weaponized it like a bureaucratic Bond villain. That was the moment I knew I was in for the long haul. I posted the footage on the neighborhood app. Nothing dramatic, just a caption that said, "New HOA policy in action. Watch your tools, folks." Within minutes, the comments started flooding in. Some were furious, some were howling with laughter. My personal favorite came from old Mrs. Cranston across the street. "She took your shovel? I hope she chokes on the handle. Also, can I borrow your leaf blower again?" Karen didn't respond online, but I knew she saw it, and I knew she was planning her next move. The next day, I got an official-looking envelope in the mail with the HOA letterhead. Inside was a fine, $50. The charge, visual obstruction due to excessive snow storage in shared sidewalk zones. Translation, she fined me for shoveling snow and stacking it on the curb. I'd been doing that for 20 years. Everyone did it. It was the only place to put the snow unless you wanted to dump it on your roses. But suddenly, it was a problem. Suddenly, I was the nuisance. I stared at the fine, then looked out the window at her house. The shovel, my shovel, was leaning against her front porch like a trophy. I wanted to knock again, demand justice, but something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the stubborn Irish part. Maybe it was the firefighter instinct for strategy. Or maybe I just snapped. Whatever it was, a plan started forming. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to threaten. I was going to fight this war the suburban way, with silent vengeance, with passive-aggressive precision. I was going to build something. Something big. Something cold. Something unforgettable. I stood there staring at her porch, the shovel, the smug aura of entitlement radiating from her hydrangeas. I whispered to myself, "You want snow? I'll give you snow." And I started sketching designs on the back of my HOA fine. A wall, 10 feet tall, all ice, all around her house. And if Karen thought a little shovel theft was the end of the story, she had no idea what was coming next. The snow fell harder the next morning, thick flakes piling on everything like nature had joined my side in this cold war. I woke up early again, same robe, same slippers, but this time I wasn't sipping coffee. I was pacing, planning. Because if I was going to pull off the greatest act of suburban vengeance this neighborhood had ever seen, I needed materials, manpower, and momentum. And right now, I had one thing: rage. That, and a very detailed sketch of a 10-foot wall of ice drawn on the back of an HOA fine. Before any wall could go up, I needed to test the waters, or the ice in this case. So I started small. I bought 3 new shovels, bright red ones, hard to miss. I chained them to my front porch like sacred artifacts and added a handwritten sign: "Private property. Do not touch. Violators will be documented and laughed at." Within an hour, I got an anonymous letter in my mailbox. Same Comic Sans font, same fake legal jargon. "Porch clutter violates aesthetic harmony codes," it said. "Please remove excess tools immediately." It didn't even pretend to be official, just a printout taped to a packet of herbal tea. That was Karen's style, passive-aggressive with a chamomile twist. I ignored the note and left the shovels where they were. That evening, I received a text from my neighbor Greg, one of the few sane people left on our block. "Did Karen seriously just fine you for having snow shovels?" I replied with a photo of the letter and 3 laughing emojis. A few minutes later, Greg came over with 2 cups of coffee and an idea. "If she wants to play cold," he said, "then we go colder. What's the plan?" That's when I told him. The wall. Not a metaphorical wall, a real one. 10 feet high. All ice, all around Karen's property. Greg choked on his coffee, then grinned like a kid about to get away with something. Word spread faster than frostbite. By the end of the day, I had a small crew of willing hands, retirees, teenagers on winter break, even Mrs. Cranston's grandkid, who just wanted to see the ice guy trap the crazy lady. I started assembling supplies. Plastic snow molds from my firefighter survival kits, old scaffolding, buckets, and industrial-strength hoses. We began slowly, under the radar. Just snow mounds at first, tall and neat like little sugar dunes lining the edges of Karen's yard. Harmless. Decorative, even. She glared from her window, but said nothing. She was waiting, I could tell, but she didn't know what was coming. By the 3rd day, the mounds had grown into walls, stacked snow bricks, doused with water, and left to freeze overnight into rock-solid ice. It was beautiful, monolithic, and it was only the beginning. Meanwhile, the neighborhood transformed into a divided camp. Half were on my side, cheering from porches, donating coffee and snacks. The other half, the silent HOA loyalists, watched with tight lips and trembling clipboards. And at the center of it all was Karen, peering out from behind her frosted curtains like a villain trapped in her own castle. She tried to fight back the day we passed the 6-foot mark. A code enforcement officer showed up. Karen had called them in, claiming I was building a hazardous structure without a permit. The officer took one look at the wall, then at me, and started laughing. Not a chuckle, a full belly laugh. I offered him a cup of hot cocoa and explained that it was all snow and water, nothing permanent. Technically, no construction, just nature's art. He shrugged and told Karen she had no legal grounds to stop me. I think that was the moment she truly snapped. Karen doubled down. She started posting daily HOA notices on the community board in our local app. "Attention residents, Frank Doyle is violating snow boundary protocols. This sets a dangerous precedent." Dangerous precedent? For what? Snow creativity. She was losing her grip, and everyone saw it. Someone even made a meme of her face pasted on the white witch from Narnia, holding my shovel like a scepter. It was glorious. But Karen wasn't finished. She retaliated the only way she knew how, by issuing more fines. $50 for snow sculpture harassment. $75 for excessive laughter on public sidewalks. $100 for encouraging wintertime gatherings without proper HOA authorization. I pinned them all to a corkboard in my window next to a printed sign that said, "Current Karen tax, $225 and rising." As the wall crept toward its final height, it became a tourist attraction. Cars slowed down to watch. Neighbors brought folding chairs and thermoses. Kids turned it into a snow fort and took turns patrolling the perimeter with plastic swords. Someone even put up a banner that read, "Operation Ice Fortress, sponsored by the people." Karen lost her mind. She tried to call the police again, this time claiming she was being contained against her will. The responding officer was the same one from before. He looked at the wall, looked at Karen, then looked at me with a smile and said, "Ma'am, unless this gentleman is physically blocking your exits, I suggest you stop wasting department time." I offered him a snowball. He declined, but his smirk said it all. By the end of the week, the wall stood 10 feet tall and surrounded Karen's front yard completely, with a small arched doorway that led to the sidewalk. We left her a little wooden welcome sign that read, "Frosty greetings. Please exit through the gift shop." It was the pettiest, most satisfying thing I'd ever done. But beneath the laughter and the clapping neighbors, I felt something else brewing. Because Karen wasn't just mad now, she was humiliated. And humiliation, I knew, was a dangerous motivator. Still, I had no regrets. She wanted a snow war. I gave her an avalanche. And yet, deep down, I couldn't help but feel the slightest twinge of guilt, not enough to stop, but enough to make me pause. Watching her house encased in frozen glory, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something more to her madness. But I pushed the thought aside. There was still work to be done, snow to stack, ice to shape, and one last flourish I hadn't yet revealed. Because this wasn't just a wall. This was a message. And I wasn't finished talking. Not yet. The wind howled that morning like it had something to say, and I stood outside with my scarf flapping like a general surveying a frozen battlefield. Operation Ice Fortress was no longer a joke or a neighborhood sideshow. It had become a full-blown movement. People came from blocks away just to take selfies in front of the wall. One guy live-streamed himself licking it and declared it the coldest HOA protest in American history. I wasn't sure whether to be proud or concerned, but I had to admit it was impressive. 10 feet high, curved at the corners, with sculpted edges and a little turret-style bump over her mailbox. Every inch glistened with the kind of frozen spite that only years of HOA-induced frustration could mold. But now, things had started to shift. I could feel it. Karen's usual storm of warnings and bogus fines had gone quiet. Her blinds remained shut. No morning surveillance. No afternoon passive-aggressive garden gnome adjustments. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suspicious, like the eye of a storm waiting to whip around and take out everything in its path. I didn't trust it. Not one bit. Greg and I stood shoulder to shoulder, sipping coffee while reviewing the latest patchwork repairs. A few of the lower bricks had started to soften in the midday sun, so we reapplied layers of water to refreeze them solid. My neighbor across the street, Rita, brought out thermoses of hot chocolate for the volunteers, all 12 of them, bundled in mismatched coats, boots caked with snow, wielding plastic buckets and icy spatulas like craftsmen in a medieval workshop. It was a community effort now, not just me and my grudge, but everyone who had ever been fined for planting tulips 3 inches too close to the sidewalk. Everyone who had felt Karen's cold grip in the form of laminated threats and highlighter-marked citations. The wall had become more than a wall. It was therapy. Around midday, a delivery driver arrived with a giant package addressed to me. I hadn't ordered anything, but I knew exactly what it was. The grand piece, the cherry on this frozen sundae. I opened the box and carefully unwrapped the contents. A 6-foot-tall ice sculpture of a shovel, carved from pure, crystal-clear resin, delivered by a buddy of mine from the fire department who had taken up ice sculpting after retirement. I placed it right in front of Karen's gate. It sparkled in the winter light like a frosty middle finger, standing tall and proud in the very place where this war had begun. People went nuts. Kids posed beside it with snow hats and matching scarves. Someone started a chant. Shovel strong. HOA wrong. It was absurd, yes, but also thrilling. I hadn't felt this alive in years. And still, behind the curtains of her house, Karen said nothing. That night, just after sundown, I got my first real clue that Karen wasn't done yet. I noticed a flicker of movement near the far end of the wall. Just a shadow, barely visible. I turned on my porch light, stepped outside, and found a small sign planted in the snow at the edge of the property. It read, "You've gone too far. This isn't over." There was no name, no HOA stamp, just that single ominous message. I plucked it out of the ground, turned it over. Nothing. But I could practically hear her gritting her teeth as she typed it up and printed it. And I knew whatever was coming, it would be desperate. The next morning proved me right. I woke to the sound of scraping. Hard, violent, determined scraping. I looked out and saw Karen, bundled in an enormous faux fur coat, trying to chip away at the wall with a garden trowel. She hacked at it like she was trying to break out of Alcatraz. A small crowd gathered, watching silently as she swung again and again, her movements erratic, the trowel bouncing off the ice with little effect. She finally gave up, slumped to the ground, and just sat there in the snow, panting. I watched her for a moment. Something inside me shifted again. I walked over with a mug of hot coffee and offered it to her through the narrow opening in the wall. She looked up, startled, her face flushed and wet from either sweat or tears. I couldn't tell. She didn't take the mug. She just stared at me and muttered, "You've made your point, Frank." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I walked back to my porch and sat in my rocker, sipping my own coffee as the wind started to pick up again. The next 24 hours were quiet. Too quiet. No sign of Karen. No movement. Even the usual HOA patrols had stopped. The app was silent. No digital citations, no fines, no sarcastic comments. That's when I got the knock at the door. It wasn't Karen. It was a young man, maybe 30, wearing a heavy coat and holding a duffel bag. He introduced himself as Eric, said he was Karen's son. I blinked. I hadn't even known she had a kid. He looked exhausted, nervous, like someone who hadn't slept well in years. "She called me," he said. "Said the neighborhood had turned against her. Said you'd built a fortress around her house." I didn't believe her, but now, well, he glanced at the wall, then back at me. "She's not doing great, Mr. Doyle." I invited him inside. He hesitated, then stepped in. Over coffee, we talked. He told me about her husband leaving last year, about how she'd thrown herself into the HOA as a distraction. She needed something to control, he said, something to keep her from falling apart. It hit me harder than I expected because I knew that kind of grief. I'd lived it after my wife passed. I threw myself into house projects, routines, daily walks that turned into shelling sprees. Maybe Karen hadn't been power hungry. Maybe she'd just been lost. When he left, I stood on the porch watching the wall, the sculpture, the frozen battlements. They still made me proud, but they also looked a little different now, less like justice, more like armor I didn't need anymore. I wasn't ready to take it down, not yet, but I knew the war had shifted. It wasn't about snow or shovels or HOA rules anymore. It was about something deeper, something we both understood even if we were too stubborn to say it. And somewhere behind that wall, I imagined Karen sitting by her window, staring out at the fortress she helped create, waiting for the next move. She didn't know it yet, but the thaw was coming, just not the kind she expected. The days that followed felt like a slow, deliberate countdown. I'd started something now, and I wasn't sure how to stop it, or if I wanted to. My community had rallied behind me, and the wall was no longer just a physical structure. It had become a symbol of resistance, of pride, of finally standing up against the overbearing rule of Karen and her HOA minions. But the more I stood in front of it, the more it began to feel like a ticking time bomb. What was I going to do when the last brick was laid? What would happen when Karen, with all her icy resolve, finally found a way to tear it down? Greg came by every day, checking the wall, making sure the bricks held firm, making sure the temperatures stayed cold enough to keep the ice intact. The neighbors popped in too, sometimes with coffee, sometimes just to watch the spectacle from a safe distance. People started talking about it like it was the new town attraction. "You hear what's going on with Frank and Karen? Man's building a wall. Karen's losing her mind." It was ridiculous, and yet, it had become the event of the season. But Karen had been quiet. Too quiet for someone who once flooded every neighborhood message board with HOA complaints and passive-aggressive memos. Her sudden absence was unsettling. I knew something was coming. She wouldn't sit back and let this play out. She had too much pride, too much anger. But I wasn't ready for what happened next. It started with the sound of scraping again, this time not from Karen, but from the other side of the wall. I stood up instantly, alert, and peered through the gap where the bricks had a slight curve, just enough to see what was happening. Karen wasn't there. Instead, I saw a man, tall and unshaven, wearing a beanie and carrying a large sledgehammer. He was trying to break down the wall, not with finesse or intelligence, but with brute force. The guy swung the hammer with a kind of intensity you'd reserve for a wrecking ball, but the ice was holding strong. He hit the wall again and again, his rage growing as the sledgehammer barely made a dent. My first instinct was to laugh. He looked ridiculous. But then I saw the name on his coat. It was Eric, Karen's son. I grabbed my coat, hustled out the door, and marched toward the scene. "What in the hell are you doing?" I shouted as I approached. He stopped, frozen mid-swing, looking guilty like a kid caught stealing from the cookie jar. "Frank, I don't know how to stop her," Eric stammered, putting the hammer down. "She's gone off the deep end. She's threatening to sue the whole neighborhood. She says if you don't take down the wall, she'll destroy everything you care about. I'm just trying to stop the chaos." I let out a long breath, leaning against the frozen barricade. "Eric, you don't even know what you're up against. This isn't a wall, it's a message. You think swinging that hammer is going to fix anything? It's just going to make things worse." He stood there for a long time, looking at the wall, then back at me. His shoulders sagged, and I saw the frustration in his eyes. "You don't get it, Frank. She's my mom. I'm supposed to help her, not let her turn into this monster. She's obsessed with this stupid HOA. I don't know how to pull her out of it. I don't know how to make her see what's happening." I felt a pang of something. Guilt, maybe? I'd been so focused on getting revenge that I hadn't considered the collateral damage. I'd only seen Karen as the enemy. But Eric was right. She was his mother, the woman who raised him. And no matter how much she'd pushed everyone away, no matter how many fines and threats she'd issued, she was still a human being beneath all the rules and regulations. I stood there, feeling the weight of it all. What had I done? What was I turning this into? The truth hit me like a ton of snow. I'd built this fortress not just to punish Karen, but to prove a point to the whole damn neighborhood. To make people see that I wasn't going to let myself get bullied anymore. But in doing so, I had become part of the same problem I was trying to escape. I wasn't fighting an oppressive HOA anymore. I was fighting Karen. And that wasn't the same thing at all. I took a deep breath and looked at Eric. "I get it," I said softly. "I get why you're trying to stop me. But this wall isn't the issue. Your mom. She's the issue. And I don't know how to fix that. But I'm willing to try." Eric stared at me for a long moment, then nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and exhaustion. "So what now?" I thought about it for a moment. What now? What was the right way forward? The wall had become a symbol of everything I'd been fighting for. But the more I looked at it, the more it seemed like an unnecessary escalation. Maybe it was time for something else. Maybe it was time for a conversation. "I'm going to talk to her," I said. "I don't know if it'll do any good, but it's the only chance we've got." Eric nodded again, a quiet relief settling over him. I turned to leave, but before I could go, he stopped me. "Frank, if she's not going to listen to reason, what will you do?" I didn't have an answer for that. I'd never had to negotiate peace before. I'd always been the one fighting fire with fire. But this wasn't a fire. This was ice. And ice, as I was learning, could melt. I trudged over to Karen's house, my heart heavy with the realization that I was about to face the woman who had been both my adversary and my neighbor, the one who had made my life a bureaucratic nightmare. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I was about to turn around and leave when I heard her voice, sharp, brittle, coming from the other side of the door. "What do you want, Frank?" I took a breath, steeling myself for what was coming. "I want to talk," I said simply. There was a long silence, and then the sound of the door unlocking. When it opened, Karen stood there, her eyes bloodshot, her coat tightly pulled around her like a shield. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me as though unsure of what to expect. I took another step forward. "I don't want to fight anymore, Karen," I said. "I don't want to tear down your wall. But I want you to understand something. This isn't about the snow. It never was." Karen looked away, her shoulders trembling. She seemed to shrink under the weight of it all. "I just wanted control," she whispered. "Just something that was mine. Something that didn't feel like it was slipping away." And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't about the shovel. This was about loss. And that was something I could relate to more than I cared to admit. The morning after our conversation, I stood at the edge of the ice wall, looking at what I had built. 10 feet of frozen fury, weeks of work, gallons of water, and an army of neighbors armed with buckets and shovels. It stood like a frosty monument to stubbornness, pride, and revenge. But now, with the storm inside me finally settling, it looked more like a relic of a war I no longer wanted to win. Karen hadn't said much when I left her doorstep, just a quiet nod, the kind people give when they've been hit with a truth too heavy to argue. I wasn't sure if I'd reached her. I didn't know if the wall would come down or if it would stand there until spring. All I knew was something had changed. Greg showed up around 9 with his usual thermos of coffee and a curious look on his face. He stood beside me, watching the morning sun bounce off the jagged edges of the wall. It looked beautiful in the light, casting soft blue shadows on the snow. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he finally said, "So, are we still guarding the gate, or are we knocking it down?" I didn't answer right away. I looked out at the neighborhood, the familiar houses, the sidewalks lined with salt and snow, and the dozen or so people who had helped me build this frozen fortress. Kids were throwing snowballs behind us. Someone had decorated the wall with Christmas lights that now blinked with a kind of ironic cheer. The community had made this together, but they hadn't signed up for a siege. They wanted fun. They wanted laughter. They wanted something more than just the endless drama of Karen and her rules and my retaliation. And maybe, deep down, so did I. I turned to Greg and said, "We're taking it down. Not because she won, not because I lost, but because I'm tired of fighting people who live 15 feet away." He nodded, and that was it. We didn't make a speech. We didn't post an announcement. We just grabbed shovels and started chipping away. And when people saw what we were doing, they joined in. One by one, neighbors came outside, bundled up in puffy coats and thick gloves, wielding shovels and snow blowers, chisels, and old spatulas. It became a demolition party. Someone brought music. Kids danced on top of snow piles. A teenager set up a speaker and blasted classic rock as the wall began to fall. Karen watched from her window at first, hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked smaller somehow, like the Cold War we'd waged had taken more from her than she'd expected. But then, something incredible happened. She stepped outside. No clipboard, no gavel, no laminated notices. Just her. And after standing there for a long, frozen moment, she picked up a shovel and started digging with the rest of us. Nobody cheered, but you could feel it. This quiet shift, like an ice dam cracking and letting the river finally flow. She worked in silence beside me, not looking at me, not speaking, just moving snow with slow, focused energy. And I did the same. We didn't need words right then. Sometimes, doing the work says more than any apology. By noon, the wall was down to half its size. By 2, only a few icy stumps remained. The sculpture of the shovel had been moved to my yard, repurposed as a monument to community stubbornness. A few kids built a snow maze where the wall had once stood, while the adults gathered around thermoses and passed around baked goods like peace offerings. Someone handed Karen a cup of cider. She took it with a small smile. Later that day, Eric returned. He stood by his mother and gave me a nod. I returned it. Nothing more needed to be said. It was done. But then came the part one never expected. 2 days later, I got a letter in the mail. No Comic Sans, no HOA logo, just a plain white envelope with my name written in surprisingly neat cursive. Inside was a formal resignation letter. Karen had stepped down from the HOA. Attached was another note, this one handwritten. It said, "Frank, I lost track of what mattered. The wall showed me that. Thank you for not giving up on people like me, even when I gave you every reason to." I sat there staring at the letter for a long time. It was strange. That small piece of paper felt heavier than the entire wall I had built. The following weekend, something even stranger happened. The HOA held a community meeting, this time outdoors in the park at the end of the street. No podium, no Robert's Rules of Order, just a big thermos of cocoa, a folding table, and a few dozen folding chairs. And instead of Karen leading it, it was Greg. But he wasn't trying to become the next tyrant in a winter parka. He stood up and said, "I think it's time the HOA stopped being about rules and started being about people. Let's do fewer fines and more community events. Let's build stuff together." Someone shouted, Snowball fights count as events? Greg nodded. The crowd cheered. In the weeks that followed, things changed. Not overnight, and not perfectly, but the air felt lighter. People started helping each other shovel. The HOA stopped enforcing ridiculous bylaws. Karen stayed quiet for a while, but then she showed up to help organize a winter carnival. She even brought cookies, real ones, not metaphorical ones attached to warnings. And then one morning, I found a box on my porch. No note, no label. Inside was a snow shovel. Not mine, a new one. But it was beautiful, metal reinforced, comfortable handle, top of the line. And engraved on the blade? Just 2 words, stay frosty. I smiled for the first time in a long while, not just because of the gift, but because I realized something. The wall had never been about keeping people out. It had been about trying to prove I still mattered, that I could stand up for myself, that I wasn't just some old man people could ignore. And in doing so, I found something better than revenge. I found community. I found purpose. And maybe, just maybe, I found a little forgiveness. That winter, the snow kept coming, but we didn't fight it anymore. We welcomed it together. We built forts, mazes, snowmen that would have made Michelangelo proud. We drank hot cocoa around fire pits and told stories about the wall, the shovel, and the war that ended not with a bang, but with a shovel and a smile. And every time I looked out my window and saw Karen waving at the neighbors or laughing at some kid's snow angel, I thought to myself, maybe this old heart of mine had a little more room for surprises. Because in the end, it wasn't just a story about snow and pettiness and passive-aggressive HOA notices. It was about change, real, messy, uncomfortable change, and the people who choose to go through it, even if it takes a 10-foot wall of ice to get there.